AM 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. On the phone, I have Laramie County District Attorney Leigh Manlove. Good morning, Leigh.
Doug, good morning. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, thank you for calling in. Of course, we originally set this up to talk about how the budget cuts are impacting your office, and we're going to get to that, but I absolutely had to ask about the face mask mandated enforcement. Do we know how this is going to work?
I do not. It is a county-wide mask mandate that was implemented through the authority of the state health officer and the county health officer, and frankly, I'm not enforcing a mask mandate. I don't even have sufficient resources to enforce crime. So there may be an official out there who knows what the consequence will be for somebody who doesn't wear a mask, but it ain't this one.
So you won't be prosecuting anybody for that?
Correct.
Okay. Now, Leigh, to get to the topic we originally had set up, budget cuts. It's had a big impact on your office. Is that right?
Unfortunately, it has fundamentally changed what my office is able to do in terms of enforcing the law. I have lost a position for a legal assistant. I have 2 attorney positions that remain unfilled, and the staff and attorneys in my office are having to furlough the equivalent of 1.5 staff positions. And we were a small agency to begin with, and we were really beyond our maximum capacity before the budget cuts. So when this happened, then it has to give somewhere. And I had to make a decision about what I was going to prioritize. And violent felonies are a priority. Subsequent DUIs are a priority. Domestic violence is a priority. Crimes against children. That really leaves thousands and thousands of other kinds of cases with very little ability for my office to prosecute.
So obviously you're having to prioritize here because you can't do everything you'd like to be able to do. How did you set those priorities?
Well, first of all, I looked at who is harmed by an offense. And if there is a victim, sometimes it's referred to as a people crime, clearly that person has been harmed, that person has been hurt. But from there, I really had to do a lot of soul searching and dig a little deeper. So if the victim is a corporation, let's say Target or Menards or Safeway, and by victim I mean they are the person, the entity who's been harmed because someone is shoplifting or an employee is embezzling money. There are other avenues for that corporation to seek redress. They can initiate internal proceedings. They can go through the civil courts. But, for example, if you're an infant who's born addicted to methamphetamine, you don't have the ability that Target Corporation does to seek redress in the courts. And so even though, and most people are shocked when they learn that giving birth to a meth-addicted baby is a misdemeanor, even though it's just a misdemeanor, we're still charging that offense for a couple of reasons. Number one, that baby is an innocent victim. Number two, mom's conduct is illegal. Using methamphetamine is illegal. Number three, the cost to the state, because ultimately that's who bears the cost for a meth-addicted infant, is enormous. There are health care costs, short-term and long-term. Typically there are special education costs attached to that kiddo. And then there's the cost within the Department of Family Services and the juvenile court trying to find an appropriate placement for that infant. And so from a moral perspective, to me, that was a case that has to be prosecuted. But it's a gut-wrenching decision. There are a lot of people who are small business owners, homeowners, who are the victims of property crime. And unfortunately, that's just not a case that I can prioritize with reduced services.
Now, I did go to a news conference this week at the Cheyenne Police Department, Chief Kozak, and I'm going from memory here, so I hope I have all the details right, but he talked about some property crime cases with rather substantial damages being declined. I think one was something, and again, I'm going from memory, something like $32,000 worth of stolen property. And right now, you just can't prosecute it, or at least that's what the chief said. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. And I have the highest regard for law enforcement in our community, and one of my very deep concerns is that the budget cut that is affecting my agency in a very real way impacts officer safety. And that's because if you are somebody who doesn't really care if you're hurting other people, you don't really care if you're hurting yourself, you're driving drunk, you're using drugs, you're causing property damage, you're stealing things, you know there aren't consequences. The people committing those offenses know that the Laramie County Detention Center will not accept those arrestees in an effort to try and really fight coronavirus infection within the jail. They know that my office is not able to prosecute those offenses. And so it's really no different and no more complicated than when a child knows there's a rule and breaks the rule, and then there are no consequences from mom or dad.
Now,
there are no consequences. You continue to do whatever it is that you want, and that will have a huge impact on the quality of life in our community. And that is astounding to me and extremely concerning, because this is a decision that has been made through an administrative process. The governor has to provide to the legislature a balanced budget. That's a constitutional requirement. And Governor Gordon has done that. But in so doing, there has been a huge, impactful effect on the quality of life in Laramie County. And we're just at the beginning.
When you say we're just at the beginning, I guess nobody knows how long the situation is going to last. But what are some effects you anticipate in the foreseeable future?
Well, one of the things Chief Kozak and I have discussed is that property crimes, for the first time in 20 years in Laramie County, have fallen. And Chief Kozak thinks that that is a direct correlation to tough, aggressive prosecution by my office. That's the only change. And so we finally reached that achievement and that goal. Boom. What happens? Budget cuts. And I can no longer provide tough, aggressive prosecution for those kinds of crimes. So I don't know if listeners remember, but about a year ago there were some churches in town that were vandalized with graffiti. And the offenders were identified and they were prosecuted. And, that is good for the community. We don't want our churches vandalized. We don't want people to go to their place of worship and see property damage and destruction. And yet, if it weren't for my office being able to prosecute offenders and hold them accountable, my concern is we're going to see more and more and more of that. And how does that affect you? How does that affect the quality of life in a community? And I think it's a profoundly troubling likelihood, possibility.
Leanne, and I should have asked this at the outset just to set the parameters, and I failed to do so, but exactly how much was your budget cut by, and what's the direct impact?
My budget was reduced by 6%, which is somewhat less than other executive branch agencies. And I appreciated the dialogue that my office had the opportunity to go back and forth with the governor's office a little bit. But even still, 6% cut to my office was profound, because 90% of my funding goes to payroll. 90% of my expenses are my people. We are what we do. We prosecute. We don't have a PR budget. We aren't buying expensive equipment. We aren't, we're not that kind of an agency. And so when I had to make a budget reduction, in compliance with the governor's mandate, it had to come from my people. And I already was very, very much treading water. One of the interesting things I found in doing some research is that in 1995, the Office of the District Attorney prosecuted approximately 700 cases and did that with 9 state-funded attorneys. Last year, in 2019, the Office of the District Attorney prosecuted 5,200 cases with 9 state-funded attorneys and 2 attorneys who are funded through federal grants, one for domestic violence and one for drug interdiction. So that, and I'm not good at math, that's the other Manlove in my house, my husband, the math teacher, but that's more than a 2,000% increase. And we were just barely able to keep our heads above water. But then with the reality that I have furloughs that equate 1.5 positions, 2 attorney positions I'm not able to fill, and the loss of a legal assistant, we don't have the capacity to continue tough, aggressive prosecution for every offense.
Okay, I'm speaking with Laramie County District Attorney Leigh Manlove. We are taking calls. If you have any comments or questions, 632-3323 is the number. And Leigh, again, back to the Chiefs news conference the other day, and I'm sure you're aware of this. They said they're going to start taking some people who are arrested to the Platte County Jail. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like that may not matter much because you just don't have the ability to go after these folks. Am I understanding it right?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, Doug, because at least the Cheyenne Police Department has an alternative. They can issue a citation to an offender through municipal court, which is the city of Cheyenne. And then that offender is adjudicated through municipal court rather than state court, which is the DA's office. So, for example, let's say you run a stop sign and you're given a citation for that by a police officer. They can choose, the officer has the discretion to issue that citation to state court through the DA's office or municipal court through the city of Cheyenne. And so in my conversation with the police department, and I really have to give a shout out to local law enforcement agencies. They've been so wonderful in helping my office try and wrestle with this enormous challenge. They said, you know what, we'll try citing people through municipal court. I don't know that they have the capacity to absorb thousands of cases, but at least there's that option available to the police department. The Laramie County Sheriff's Office does not have that option. Wyoming Highway Patrol doesn't have that option. The Division of Criminal Investigation does not. The Medicaid Fraud Unit through the Attorney General's Office does not. The Department of Family Services, Laramie County School Districts 1 and 2 do not. Wyoming Game and Fish does not have that option. And those are all agencies for whom we prosecute their cases, the majority of which are misdemeanors.
Okay, now again, I'm going to test my understanding of the situation here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding would be if it's tried in municipal court, they don't handle felonies. Am I right about that?
Correct.
So anybody who goes to municipal court will be facing a misdemeanor charge?
Correct. And so in the example that the chief gave where, there was thousands and thousands of dollars worth of damage to the victim, that is a felony. In Wyoming, the legislature determined that threshold to be more than $1,000. But I have 11 child sex abuse cases sitting on my desk right now for review, for analysis, for a charging decision. And I simply cannot, in good conscience, place those cases behind a property crime. And so, in the event that that person is cited into municipal court, that is a felony amount of damage, but it will only be a misdemeanor because of the limitations of municipal court.
But from the chief's comments the other day, and I totally understand this, his take on it was, well, at least if we take it to municipal court, they're not going to walk away scot-free. They'll get some kind of punishment. Would you kind of fall in line with that way of thinking?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is absolutely not the district attorney that I campaigned to be. I'm not some kind of a liberal like my colleagues in San Francisco and Philadelphia and Chicago. My platform was never, oh, let's legalize all kinds of conduct that policymakers have determined should be criminal. And yet the financial reality has done exactly that. It has created decriminalization of a huge amount of conduct that's happening here in Laramie County. And it was done without the benefit of the public's input. There was no public policy debate in the legislature. This has been purely an administrative, financially driven decision. And the other thing that I find just incredibly troubling is, when you listen to the news, like everybody who's on 650 AM, you know what's happening in the country. You know about civil unrest, Black Lives Matter, police misconduct, governmental overreach, and when you hear about defund the police, that's what's happened here in Laramie County, and that's what's happened in Natrona County. Because when you defund the prosecutor, it's the functional equivalent of defunding the police. And I believe that people in Laramie County and Natrona County, where my counterpart, Dan Itzen, is the DA, I believe that those folks should have a voice in that decision.
AM 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. You're in tune with the Weekend in Wyoming program. On the phone, I have Laramie County District Attorney Leanne Manlove. And Leanne, for those who are with us, you've already laid out that you are going to prioritize violent crimes against people over property crimes. Where do drug offenses fit in the spectrum? Is that still something you're going over, or not so much, or case by case, or how does that work?
That's a really good question, Doug. So we have a federal grant through the Department of Justice for what's been called a high-intensity drug traffic area, and that is Laramie County, the bisection of I-80 and I-25, the railroad. It's a high-traffic area for drug distribution. So we remain committed to prosecuting felony offenses. That attorney position and the legal assistant position are funded through a grant through the Department of Justice, and we work in tandem with the federal prosecutor in Wyoming, the U.S. Attorney's Office. But in terms of misdemeanor offenses, which is where you find the majority of drug crimes in Laramie County, those tend to be possession crimes. Somebody has less than the felony amount of marijuana. We're not prosecuting those first offenders. Now, if it's a second offense, we will prosecute those. And then your third offense is a felony, so clearly that's being prosecuted. We are trying to still prosecute misdemeanor possession of cocaine, heroin, LSD. Fentanyl is making a comeback. Methamphetamine is just ravaging our community. And so we are committed to prosecuting those for now. But my concern is that the governor has told executive branch agencies that we have to submit an additional 10% cut to our agencies. And if that happens here in Laramie County, my office will only be able to prosecute violent felonies that are people crimes, and then the felony drug cases.
So you'd still be able to go after somebody for a pound of meth, for example?
Sure, and in fact, just within the last 12 days, we had a case with a seizure of more than 5 pounds of methamphetamine. And, most people don't understand what a felony amount is, but I think everybody has seen those sugar alternatives, little sweeteners like Sweet and Low or Equal, Splenda. So one of those little packets, that's a misdemeanor amount of methamphetamine. More than that is a felony amount. So imagine how many of those little packets you'd need to create 5 pounds of methamphetamine. That is a very significant offender. And so we are prosecuting and will continue to prosecute felony drug offenses. But really, I'm concerned that the impact of our inability to prosecute low-level misdemeanor drug offenses, it's going to have a serious consequence on the quality of life in Cheyenne and the surrounding community.
Are we seeing any of that yet, or do we know?
That was a really good question that Joint Judiciary Committee put to both Dan Itzen and I. And we don't have that information available. So we cannot in real time tell anybody what the impacts are. And that's the scary part to me. I think by the time we're able to articulate using data what the impacts have been in our community, it's going to be way too late to try and put that genie back in the bottle. And then I think we're going to have some very dire consequences that, right now I might sound like Chicken Little and the sky is falling, but a year from now, I might be 100% correct.
Okay, I'm speaking with Laramie County District Attorney Leanne Manlove. Leanne, we're coming up on a bottom of the hour break here in about 2 minutes. I actually don't have anybody scheduled at 11:33. Would you be willing to hang on and talk a little more? I think this is a big issue. Okay, and by the way, we are go ahead.
I'd love to hear some comments from constituents and voters and people in the community and maybe surrounding counties about how they view this issue.
And that line is open. 632-3323 is the telephone number for that. This is probably not going to get any better anytime soon. It doesn't look like our state revenues are going to pick up anytime soon. We do have a legislative session coming up in the not too distant future. Do you expect any moves that might address this situation in any way, shape, or form?
I'm very hopeful, and I'm cognizant. I think, as are most people, we've got a significant revenue shortfall. And we're not the feds. We can't print money. And we have to look within spending to identify where we can make cuts. And, of course, that is a very difficult decision that legislators are going to have to wrestle with. But as a conservative, as a Republican, I think that people's constitutional rights and public safety are among the fundamental functions and operations of government. And there are other exceptional state agencies who do wonderful work, who are not taxed with ensuring constitutional rights, who are not part of ensuring public safety. And I believe that during these difficult decision times, those entities are the ones who need to be either eliminated altogether or significant funding reduced.
Leanne, I hate to cut you off here. We're about 20 seconds out of the break, but we'll keep you on the phone and continue this conversation on the other side of the bottom of the hour.
Sounds great.
AM 650 KGAB, you're in tune with the Weekend in Wyoming program. AM 650 KGAB, you're in tune with the Weekend in Wyoming program. On the phone, we have Laramie County District Attorney Leanne Manlove. We are taking comments. If anybody has a question or comment, 632-3323. Leanne, I did get somebody who messaged me on Facebook back to the face mask ordinance. You said you won't be prosecuting anybody for it. Does that mean those crimes won't be prosecuted in Laramie County, or do we know?
They will not be prosecuted by me. And I'm not even sure that we can call that a crime.
Okay. Could it be prosecuted by the city attorney conceivably, or the county attorney?
I suppose conceivably it could be. I have not had a conversation with anyone about any kind of enforcement with a mask mandate.
Now, you mentioned you're not sure it could be called a crime. Is that because it's a mandate and not a law? Or help me out with this a little bit. Why wouldn't that be a crime?
Well, in my world, a crime is something that has been declared so by the legislature. It's been codified under state statute. There was public policy debate around it, and there are penalties attached to it. Whether it's, you got to do some time in jail, or there's a prison sentence because it's a felony. You have to pay restitution. There's a potential fine attached to it. And a mask mandate is not a crime. So I don't know what the enforcement mechanism is. I don't know how you can explain the constitutionality of that. I just am flabbergasted that there are people who called my office yesterday and the day before asking if my office would be prosecuting people for not wearing masks, and the very simple answer is no.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like even if you had the money, you're not sure this is really something you'd be going after. Am I right?
You know, Doug, I think that each person has to make a decision about whether or not they're going to wear a mask. And obviously, as a state employee, I will be following Governor Gordon's directive issued yesterday regarding state employees in Laramie County wearing face coverings. We've already been doing that in the city-county courthouse. We've been doing it in the courtrooms. We've been doing it, you know, as we're walking through the building. And so, for me, that's obviously something that I've already been doing. But in terms of calling it a crime or enforcing it, that is not going to come from the district attorney's office. I can't even prosecute people who are driving drunk for the first offense. To me, this is a nonsensical debate, because somebody who's driving drunk, that has been determined to be a crime by our policymakers. But because I don't have the resources to prosecute it, I'm not. To suggest that somehow a mask mandate is the equivalent of that crime, to me, is, I just don't understand that. I can't even call it logic. I don't understand that. And so my office will not be prosecuting any kind of violations of a mask mandate.
Now, you mentioned, and moving off into a different subject here, you mentioned first offense drunk driving. So what would happen to people who are arrested for that right now, or are they arrested for it? How does all that work?
So back in March, when COVID really became something that I think everybody was aware of and we were all learning about, the Laramie County Detention Center had to make a decision about how they were going to manage that disease within the jail. And they've done an exceptional job of containing it and ensuring the safety and well-being of inmates and people who work within that institution. One of the decisions was that they would no longer accept people who were arrested for low-level offenses. For example, first offense DUI, driving under the influence. And that was in part to really contain the spread of the virus. But your question, what happens to those folks? So if they don't stay in jail, and I'm not able to prosecute them, if it's the Laramie County Sheriff's Office or a different entity who's made that arrest, there is no enforcement of the law.
So people can just drive drunk right now with no consequences, essentially?
That is why I am running around trying to explain this issue to people. This is a huge public safety concern.
And I want to be clear on this so people don't lie the blame at the wrong door. Your office is funded through the state. This isn't a decision made by the Laramie County Commissioner or the City Council or anybody of that nature. This is a state funding decision.
Yes. So the governor in June had asked all executive branch agencies, so this doesn't affect YDOT because they're funded through the fuel tax. It didn't affect the judicial branch because they're not the executive branch of government. It didn't affect the legislative branch because they're not the executive branch. So it's just executive branch agencies had to identify a 10% budget cut and submit that to the governor, which my office did. It's available online, and you can see that when I submitted that proposed reduction, I said in what was labeled the narrative of consequences, basically what's going to happen if your agency is cut. I explained all of these things. I explained my office will not be able to staff treatment courts. Laramie County is very fortunate. We have an excellent treatment court program for DUIs, drugs, and veterans. But state law mandates that a prosecutor be a part of that treatment court team. And although we're trying to work with the county commissioners and the circuit courts here in Laramie County who run treatment courts to come up with an alternative. If there is an alternative to somebody from my office being on that treatment court team by December 31st, we are withdrawing. And we know treatment courts are really, really successful. The data from across the country shows us that's the best way to achieve a very low reoffense rate. And yet, that's one of the areas that I have to cut because I have to have one of my few prosecutors in a courtroom. And staffing a treatment court takes a lot of time. And it wasn't a program that was specifically funded. In other words, we didn't get additional funding from the state to participate in treatment courts. We just did it because we could. But now, with our budget cuts, we will no longer be able to. And that's just one example. It's really a domino effect with the budget cuts in my office.
This must be frustrating, am I right?
You know, I'm not asking for anybody to feel bad for me, but this is causing enormous stress for me personally and for the people who work in my office, for our first responders, because this is a fundamental change in public safety and community wellness. And, you know, here's another example. Everybody has seen the weigh stations, right, on the interstate. And we know big trucks are supposed to pull over and they go through a whole series of checks. WYDOT is the one who runs those ports of entry. And they have federal requirements that mandate how they're supposed to do those checks. And it's all for public safety. We're all traveling on the same roads. We all want to be sure that those huge, enormous trucks are safe. And yet, when I'm not able to prosecute, those are low-level offenses. They're misdemeanors. It's not just impacting public safety, but the federal requirements that are part of WYDOT's compliance with those weigh stations, those are in jeopardy too, because if they have a certain volume of cases that are not prosecuted or that are found not guilty, that affects their compliance rate.
Leanne, looks like we have a caller. Good morning, caller. You're on the...
Oh, hi, Doug. This is Micah.
Hey, Micah.
Leanne, I've got a question for you, too. I was over at the jail yesterday. Several people were meeting with a representative from Sheriff Glick's office, and I also volunteer over there, and I made the comment at the end. I was like, gosh, you know, I wonder when we're ever going to start opening up the jail, you know, even just for our programs. And he indicated, too, that it really has been hard on the inmates as well. So, you know, with all of this cut back into funding, with the COVID restrictions where people can't even get to some of their jobs anymore, and so they can't even donate now to fundraisers to help out our police and our fire people. But, you know, there was so much positive energy going through those meetings, too. And even though, of course, it's not 100% cure-all, it certainly reduced a lot of the inmates' stress and gave them options when they came out. So, I mean, in a way, it was kind of helping out, you know, our counselors in town, too. So, you know, one thing impacts another. And I don't know, do you have any suggestions what we as the public can do to help even just curb this COVID stuff? Because I think once we all get back on track again, we will be able to have the funding to donate if necessary to get your office and, you know, help out our firemen and our law enforcement.
Well, Mike, I appreciate your call and I appreciate the work that you do. It's really important. You know, just because you are charged with a crime or you're in jail does not mean that you're a bad person. It means probably that you've done something stupid or foolish or reckless, clearly illegal. But it doesn't mean you're a bad person. And so I appreciate the work that people within our community do to help our inmates even just get through serving their sentence, and particularly when they are reintegrated back into civilian world. But in terms of my office, you know, it's That's really a function of state revenue. And we know that oil and gas have been profoundly negatively impacted. And then when you look at how COVID, as Mike referred to, how that's impacted the financial well-being of people within our community, I think one of the most important things that people can do is communicate. So talk to your legislators, talk to your representatives, talk to your senators, and let them know that this is an important issue for you, that you want your representatives to understand that how people are adjudicated through the criminal justice system matters. And they're going to have to make some extremely difficult decisions with the budget, and so they need to hear from people who they represent about how their constituents feel money should be allocated.
AM 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. You're in tune with the Weekend in Wyoming program. I'm speaking with Laramie County District Attorney Leigh Manlove. We're talking about the impact of budget cuts on her agency. Leigh, how about budget cuts on the court system? Are judges being scaled back in the number of cases they can hear and that sort of thing, or is that not an impact?
You know, as I had mentioned earlier, the budget impact thus far has just been to the executive branch. So the judicial branch has not seen any kind of budget reduction. Although I think that is a very likely possibility when the legislature reconvenes and they're looking at all budgets across the state. And during COVID, we've continued to work much like first responders and frontline workers. We've had court every day. We've adapted in that we're wearing masks. We're trying to do a lot of court by video conference, particularly in district court. And so the biggest impact has been in our ability to do trials. Because, of course, the very nature of a trial, bringing in a whole bunch of people for jury selection and then putting 12 people in a little tiny room together for them to debate whether or not a person is innocent or guilty and achieve a verdict, those very fundamental facets of a jury trial have not been possible under COVID. There are trial plans in place. There's one here for the district court, there's one here for the circuit court, but we have not actually had a trial in Laramie County State Court since March of 2020. So that has had a huge impact on the trials. The list of cases set for trial in the district and circuit court is staggering. But, you know, we have to ensure public safety and balance that against ensuring the defendant's constitutional rights. It's been very difficult.
Speaking of which, it's pretty well known that a defendant has a right to a speedy trial. I think under Wyoming law, and you would know this better than I, it's 180 days if I'm not mistaken. So are people just walking because of a speedy trial provision?
You are correct. Wyoming law, speedy trial is 180 days by rule. The right to a speedy trial under Wyoming's Constitution does not have a timeline attached to it. But the Wyoming Supreme Court, in a couple of different cases, the Berry decision, the Lafferty decision, they've said that, you know, a delay of more than 700 days is per se unconstitutional. And then there's analysis of to whom do we attribute that delay? Is it the defendant who caused the delay? Is it the prosecution? Or is it kind of a neutral, the court? And part of what you look at, too, in Wyoming is a court rule. It's Wyoming Criminal Procedure Rule 48. And there is a due administration of justice provision under Rule 48 that our courts have been operating under during COVID restrictions. So no, people have not been walking because of speedy trial issues associated with COVID, but we believe as prosecutors that it will be a very real issue on appeal.
So some of these convictions perhaps could be thrown out on this basis, or at least that's a concern.
It's a concern. Whether or not that actually comes to pass, of course, that's a projection and a prognostication down the road. And the courts have been very careful to make detailed findings about COVID, the impact that the pandemic has had on court operations. every defendant has an opportunity under Rule 48 to object for a hearing to create a record. And, I believe as a community, as a state, as a country, we have to find a way to live with this virus. And we're all struggling to figure out what that is, and that includes the criminal justice system.
In view of the fact that property crimes right now, as things stand, basically just can't be prosecuted, apparently, should people take extra steps to protect themselves? You should lock your car, obviously, anyway, but what can people do to protect themselves against property crimes in view of the fact that maybe the justice system can't do what they'd like right now?
And that's a great point. Really, we're coming into the holiday season, and people are going to be getting a lot of packages. And, you need to figure out how that can work for you. Maybe having, an expensive thing delivered by Amazon to your front door when you're at work is not the best way to go. And unfortunately, those are crimes that my office just will not be able to prosecute under the conditions created by the budget reduction. And so you're right. People have to really start being aggressive within how they protect themselves regarding, property crime. And you would be amazed at all of the people in Laramie County who have the Ring doorbell that records a video of their front door, people who have exterior video cameras, and that's great. But that's evidence, and evidence is only helpful if your prosecutor is able to prosecute. And right now we can't. So I don't want anyone to have a false sense of security that might be created by thinking, oh, I have surveillance cameras on my house. People are going to have to go a little bit further than that and be very thoughtful about how they protect themselves from what I anticipate will be, unfortunately, a rise in property crime.
Leanne, question on Facebook, and you may have perhaps addressed this as I sort of understand it, but I'll ask the question anyway. Any insight on how voting will be handled on November 3rd if someone doesn't wear a mask? Seems her office would not prosecute anyone in violation. Has she heard if law officers will keep people from voting or if they'll just advise people to social distance?
Well, I can tell you last night there was a line for voting outside the building where I work, the historic courthouse, because there's a polling place in the courthouse, and that line extended literally around the block all day long. And the clerk's office did an exceptional job, even though the poll closed at 4:30, of allowing people who were in line by 4:30 to continue to stay in line. But there were employees from the clerk's office who were ensuring that people were socially distancing. Nobody was required to wear a mask that I saw, but of course that mask mandate does not go into effect until next week. So in terms of how that will be handled, I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't really speculate. I haven't spoken with Deborah Leigh, our clerk, who might be able to give us some insight. I have not had a conversation with the police department or the sheriff's office regarding enforcement of a mask mandate. I just don't know how those agencies would respond, and of course, they're separate entities. All I can control is what I prosecute, and I will not be prosecuting people who don't wear masks.
Leanne, we're down to just a couple minutes left here. Lot to talk about in this discussion. Is there anything you'd like people to know in regard to budget cuts to your agency and the impacts emanating from that we haven't talked about that you'd like people to know about?
I think the most important thing, Doug, and I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to get this message out there, is if you don't care about prosecution of misdemeanor offenses, then this is great for you. But if you do care, you need to let your legislators know, because ultimately they will be the ones making the funding decision. So if you know Senator Tara Nethercott, and shout out to her, she was recognized as kind of the emerging leader, person of the year through the Greater Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce last night, or any of our other Laramie County delegation, please visit with them. They're all accessible. You can reach all of them through the Wyoming Legislature's website. with their email address and their phone number. Let them know how you feel. If you think that a fundamental function of government is fully funding the prosecutor's office, please share that message with them. I am, I do, I have, and I will. And my office will continue to do the best that we can, but there are just things we simply cannot do without sufficient resources.
Now, Leanne, we're almost out of time here. I did want to ask, domestic violence, are you prosecuting those cases?
Yes.
You are, because that is a violent crime after all.
Yes.
Okay. How about shoplifting? That would be a no, I would assume.
That's a no. That's an unfortunate no.
Okay, I've been speaking with Laramie County District Attorney Leanne Manlove. Looks like we have a question here, and I don't know if we're going to have time to answer this, but let me see if I can read it real quickly. What rights does the public have in dealing with people committing misdemeanors without getting into trouble themselves? Tough question?
It's a tough question because what we don't want to do is create the wild, wild west.
Right.
And you are accountable for your own conduct. So if you use an extreme level of force in response to a low-level offense, you're going to put yourself in a very difficult position. But, you know, we have a stand your ground law, and I know Senator Anthony Bouchard has spoken on that quite extensively. But that is one of the concerns that I have. What is the consequence of defunding the prosecution? Does it create a less safe community? And I think the answer is yes.
Okay, I've been speaking with Laramie County District Attorney Leanne Manlove. Leanne, we appreciate your time today. It's been very informative. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Doug, and I hope everyone has an enjoyable weekend.
You too. We'll talk to you later. AM 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. We're coming up on 12 noon. You're in tune with the Weekend in Wyoming program. KGAB, Orchard Valley, Cheyenne.